4 children nearly perish whilst asleep at their home in Johannesburg's inner city, leaving their mother frightened of what could have been.
Mhlanje ndothukile. Oxa ndivuka ndivuke ndinovalo. Andikho right tu.
Perched from within the middle of a city, economic migrants and victims of evictions say they watch helplessly as the city develops in front of them, having to negotiate squalid living spaces in the informal settlements inside the city.
We need affordable housing in the inner city. We won't go to Soweto.
It's seeing people who are already living in the inner city as sort of like a pestilence that needs to be thrown out.
As the city of Johannesburg proceeds with its inner city rejuvenation project, what is the fate of those referred to as the urban poor? Separated in 2 Johannesburg hospitals, these siblings, an 8-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 4-month-old, were admitted 2 weeks ago with serious burns following a fire. It's unclear where the fire came from. This is their home, an abandoned building in which their parents live with no electricity and no water.
Bendihlela apha endlini abantwana ndibaphekela ndibaphetyisa. Bathe xa begqiba ukutya balala. Ndacima i-flame stove ngoba ndisebenzisa iparafini, akho gesi, abugesi ukhoyo ngozibhenyu. Ndacima i-flame stove ndayibeka ngaphandle. Bathe xa begqiba ulala ndavala apha endlini, ndacima ikhandlela ndahamba ndiye next door. Ndahamba ndobukela uzalo. Khange beyiyo ne-20 minutes ndabiziswa ngubhuti olapha phandle, ndingayazi noba ebebhema okanye besenzane na ukuthi kuyatsha endlini.
Upon arrival, all 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy, had sustained burns. Luckily, all of them survived.
Lo umdala una 7 years utshe apha ebusweni nalapha ezingalweni nalapha esifubeni. Lo una 6 years yena utshe apha emqolo. Lo una 4 years utshe apha ebusweni nesandla nenyawo lase left or right. Lo una 4 months utshe apha enyaweni namadyuntyunge benakho apha ebusweni. Indaba yabantwana bam ukuthi batshile ayindiphethanga kakuhle, andonwabanga ngaphakathi emphefumlweni. Mandilala ndisele ama-brufen aphelile nangoku. Bendikhe ndacela nopasta wasecaweni ukuthi ndicela andihambise nobundihambisele ikhanseling uba ndihle nje ndothukile. Oxa ndivuka ndivuke ndinovalo, andikho right tu. Andikho right tu sisi, ngokutya nje akungeni. Ndingcamela ukuthi ndiphuze itiye or ndiphuze amanzi anoshukela.
She has been told that her children will be hospitalized for at least a month, but she says she wished they wouldn't have to come back to the same circumstances. Originally from King Williamstown, she says she came to Johannesburg to study, and together with the father of 2 of her children, they moved from one place to the next after he lost his job. She says despite her hospitality and cashier qualifications, she's struggling to find a job.
Ndifike apha ngo-2012, understand? Impilo yalapha ayikho right. Okokuqala asikho safe, and okwesibini kunama-taverns. Abantu babephuzile mhlawumbi bayalwa, uyabona abethane la emdisentshi uba ubusafe uzenzela wena ngokwakho. Mna sisi mandingafumani umsebenzi or else kuthiwe kukhona mhlawumbi indawo yohlala right esingayifumana, ndingaphuma kule ndawo nabantwana bam.
She is one of the many women organized by the Inner City Resource Centre, or ICRC, who meet regularly to share their experiences of living in derelict and crime-infested inner city buildings with no proper sanitation, electricity or water.
Most of you enihleli la, you are all head of households. I mean, abantwana babhekene ukuthi nibeke ibhodo estofini, le bhodo libeke estofini ufanele ukha amanzi estradini, usebenzise uparafin lo udurayo, usebenzise ikhandlela leli lidurayo angithi.
Many of the women among a group of people called the urban poor have experienced evictions, with some having slept in the streets and eventually found accommodation, either in abandoned buildings or bad rented spaces. They have organized themselves because, as women living in unsafe places, they're also vulnerable to crime. The urban poor are, among others, street vendors, domestic workers, waste pickers, office cleaners, and taxi drivers. They live under constant threat of eviction, but insist they too have a right to stay in the inner city due to opportunities for piece jobs and low transportation costs. For years, they have called for state-subsidized housing within their means, such as the ones provided by the city's social housing company, Joshco.
Ke dula ke le mong karana ka ra mo ke leng teng ke dula ke le mong ha ke na ngwana e mong o tronko a soka a etswa ke dula ke le mong ka mehla ke dula ka letswalo ke tshuile because a ke itse borna ke tshwantse ke e kae ha ne fela mmuso ka re ha o hela ka gore o re feta matlo a re tshwanetse.
Whenever people try to grab a land, Baba evict by the very same seat. Whenever people try to get empty buildings like Obek, Baba evict by the very same seat. Because the constitution, we have a right to adequate housing. Which house is it? There's the philosophy, if ever born. At the end of the day, but they're expecting a vote from Nina, but at the end of the day, what's an evict support?
As a person ongasebenzi or as a person oyenza i-odd job or oyi-security mhlambe uhola 3.5 angeke ungene kuma-social housing lawo, because into yokuqala if babukhuluma nge-pro-poor, if mina angisebenzi and then fanele ngiyo-apply le Joshco bangifuna i-bank statement, ngithatha i-bank statement, bangifuna i-pay slip, ngithatha i-pay slip. We have tried to engage for a long time and through advocacy, we have used pickets, we have used emails, writing, we have used marches, to raise our voices. We have submitted memorandums to the city from the first mayor, Mr. Masondo. We submitted to Pakistan, the very same demands, not anything changing, because into Yetula is we need affordable housing in the inner city. We won't go to Soweto. People are next to jobs. People are recycling here. We demand water and electricity. We have a right to access to those basic services. We have done that. Akuzange kube engagement. The only thing was an acknowledgement that we have received your memorandum.
Since its inception as a mining town, the City of Gold has seen an influx of people looking for better opportunities. After the relaxation of influx control laws and the demand for labor in an urbanizing economy, many more people started staying in the city. Research shows that around 2018, approximately 16,000 people migrated to Johannesburg, the majority of whom came from other South African provinces, frustrating the city's efforts to meet the demand, which outstrips the current provision. On the 29th of September, the ICRC, who represents over 100,000 urban poor, embarked on another one of its marches to the city council ahead of the local government elections. Among the protesters are evictees with court orders that force the city to find suitable alternative accommodation for them, but many years later, it is yet to do so. This is the Moth Building in downtown Johannesburg. Residents were placed here 12 years ago by the city, following an eviction from another part of Johannesburg, to make way for the construction of a new mall. A court order forced the city to find them alternative accommodation. From the outside, it looks like a normal building. Inside, it's an informal settlement with shacks.
It was an open space hall. It was not divided at all. So abantu mabangena la because befuna i-privacy, bazidividela ngama-curtains ukuthi at least babe ne-privacy. But now kwasha phezulu at that floor and kwabamba ama-curtains. So abantu babona ukuthi ushithi ama-curtains awekho safe, bahamba bazifunela ama-cardboard. I-situation ela is so bad because ama-toilet awasebenzi, akunamanzi asebenzayo, bekunekhishi alisebenzi, no one is maintaining.
A health hazard waiting to implode. Following the placement of the original evictees, many others from elsewhere in the city were also placed here.
Sizangena sisoyisithi baba befuna ukwakha la mall le uyibona inkulu phaya. Umnikazi wayo wayeyifuna so futhi uthe beseyithengisile indaba yethu. So ke ngoku bathi sizohlala ngapha for one.
It's a noisy place with shebeens where the young and old have to live together in a place they call home. We met another family, a mother and a son, who had also lived here for 12 years. They are originally from Amersfoort in Mpumalanga.
Ngisuke ekhaya ngeza eJones ngiboma 80 ngahlala kwezinye indawo ngapha eJohn Foster ezimnyama ndawo kulukuba basikhohlisa nje bathi indawo lana kuhleli mahala kuyaphela kwaphela vela ke ngaya ngathola i-dinner class ngahlala i-dinner class bathi nayo iyaphuma lana sibhalise sothola indawo sase siyakhishwa ke nangempela ke sizalana sahlala lana sani bathu nizohlala nje isikhashana 1 year
kuthiwe hayi nina ningahlala nikhululeke kwamanje sizontshela mase siready kwamanje sisahamba sisangena ama-flat wonke sisanifunela i-flat eli-right for nina ngoba nina ngeke sizinithathe sinimikise elokishini i-court yathi nina an-afford ukuhlala elokishini sesihleli isikhathi esingaka lana kuze kuphele u-12 years sihleli sesihlale lokhu kwenzeka izinto lana kulimala abantu bayagwaziwa abantu kanjalo izimpi zalana-ke kwangena ama-group ahlukene o-BG dinner class councillor house kwangena ama-group amaningi abantu abanye baqhamuka e-Alexander so manje asizwani ngoba singamaqembu ahlukene singama-group ahlukene asizwani kusuka impi ngento encane bese uyashaywa uyabo ushaywe ulinyazwa ngento encane ngoba abakwazi awusiyi-group yabo sesikhipha izidumbu close to 10 yezidumbu zabantu abafile la thina into besiyicela kumasipala besicela nje ukuthi angamana azizamele izindlu okungenani siyomane sihambe siyo-afforda khona ukuhlala elokishini noma singajwayelanga kodwa siyogcina sijwayela ngoba phela impilo vele uye uhlale endaweni ugcina ujwayela.
Moth is known as a Moth Memorial Building because it comes from the Moth Memorial Hospital, which was one of the few hospitals and clinics in the inner city that would cater for Black people. So the city will always make an argument that it has a historical significance to them. It was forced to become one of the alternative places because of all the pending evictions and issues that were happening in the inner city. So, I mean, you've been seeing now in the last couple of years that some other people now are being moved there when there's spaces to cater for the other challenges that the city has been faced with.
This is not the only informal settlement in the city, and observers say they are growing. Some of them say they also await the municipality to find alternative accommodation for them. Over years, the rights of evictees were cemented through numerous court orders. Among others were the Olivia Road and Blue Moonlight cases in the Constitutional Court. These two cases placed an obligation on the city to to provide temporary accommodation for those who are left homeless by state and private-led evictions, and the Grootboom case, which obliges it to provide emergency housing to those facing eviction.
The court there was actually very proactive and said, but even when there are evictions taking place or impending, there should be some form of a meaningful engagement between all the parties that are there so that we can see how we find each other and also reach some form of, an understanding even before an eviction will be brought. The interesting part is that they all follow each other, one builds from each other. Because if we start, for instance, the importance of Blue Moonlight, because it said people are likely to be, rendered homeless because of an eviction by a private landowner. The city still has an obligation, to take care of them and provide them with emergency temporarily, housing or accommodation if they do qualify to be given. So one of the criteria for them to be able to qualify would be whether you will be rendered homeless and also you will never be able to afford anywhere else in and around the city.
The Socio-Economic Rights Institute is one of the organizations that have been at the forefront of litigating on behalf of the urban poor. Along with evictions, they deal with residents who live in dangerous buildings that lack electricity, water, and other services.
There is one common thread to it, particularly in the occupied buildings, is that most of the cases, the owners are not interested in the buildings. Most of them left in the early 90s, which, in the dawn of democracy, a lot of white owners and capital fled out of the inner city, and even previous to that. And then in other cases, you do find that an owner is present, but they have, so present in the sense that we can locate them, we know who they are, but they are not interested in the building, in maintaining it, in running it. So that's broadly the case in many of these buildings. And some of them, a small amount of them, are actually even owned by the municipality itself. So a lot of the times then the residents have taken it up upon themselves to run the buildings. For a very long time, the city did not have a proactive approach to housing. And they have been, I think, in many cases dealing with case by case and offering, for example, alternative accommodation to people when they have been evicted, only when they have been ordered by the court to do so.
As part of its urban rejuvenation strategy and to deal with the problem of hijacked buildings, the city announced the concept of social housing to accommodate low-income earners and, in some instances, partnered with private partners. But this is still out of reach for those who are doing menial jobs, as they fall outside of the minimum requirements.
The challenge is that they are on a back foot, and there is not a lot of determination, as I can see, to try and catch up and even be proactive.
Urban Renewal is the City of Johannesburg's concept of rejuvenating the city centre and attracting more private investment as it continues to implement its growth and development strategy to be achieved by 2040. The city has, over the past 2 decades, been run by the ANC and DA governments, both claiming to be committed to catering for the poor, but activists disagree.
One thing is common in all of them is that it is geared more towards driving private interests into the inner city, so trying to attract private investment into the inner city. And on the other hand, it's seeing people who are already living in the inner city as sort of like a pestilence that needs to be thrown out or gotten rid of. All the times they are looking at the buildings and not the people. And so, and it tries to drive away the poor people out of the inner city so that you can get more affluent people coming into the inner city. So, and that's what also drives some of the evictions.
They do say they have pro-poor, policies. City of Cape, City of Johannesburg specific. There's a policy that was adopted called the indigent policy, for instance, that was really supposed to cater for those who are poor, who are also unable to afford basic services, water, electricity, refuse, and so forth. So what it then meant, or was supposed to do, was that it was supposed to say, if you cannot afford because of your own personal circumstances, you should then be able to make an application in terms of this specific policy so that you are able to be exempted from paying. But the difficulty is, I don't know even today who has been really able, to access it.
While the city has grappled with having to find alternative accommodation in compliance with court orders, activists say in most cases they have failed to comply. But it argued that it didn't have enough resources to cater for the demand.
The state would simply just come in and defend the case in any other manner that they wanted to defend it. So Olivia Rowe then placed that obligation, which was very significant. At least now we are able to engage the city or the state when they say, we don't have this in 1, 2, and 3. So we want to look at what are the reasonable steps, and also were there any form of engagement that took place before you can say there's nothing that you can do. So it placed them that they should engage us. They do their own verification post that judgment, to go and interview all the people that I say I represent who are occupiers who will be rendered homeless, and make that determination themselves.
So considering that the urban poor went through similar experiences of evictions and the lack of compliance with court orders under both the ANC and DA-led governments, does it mean the problem is a general lack of political will?
Lawyers who are representing them will simply say, I've also tried enough, but I'm just struggling to get instructions, because there are conflicting instructions. But then sometimes they just do not respond or reply, or just do not comply for no other reason that no one else knows. I don't think there's really any difference. What we actually saw under the DA regime, the brutalness in terms of how they dealt with not just with the evictions in the inner city, but also with the whole question of people who are in need of land and housing, even outside of the inner city, in the different townships. The city would always then respond with JMPD and the police and so forth, with terror. That's why I'm saying really it became even more worse. Even when the other political party took over, we still had more or less the same attitude on the question of land. Especially, it was very interesting to us, to me specifically, when we had to see what actually happened when lockdown was also announced. It was also through brutality and through sheer force, and that's the kind of the attitude that actually both the political parties I've seen in the city of Johannesburg took. I think for me, the approach that perhaps we should take, it's not really a municipality-related issue, but I think it's also a sort of a state-related or whole government-related issue entirely. Because if you cannot deal with the countrysides and deal with land and deal with with housing and deal with jobs in the countryside and opportunities also in the countrysides, then we are likely always going to have a crisis also in the inner cities, or in all the big cities.
We approached the city of Johannesburg to respond to questions on the inner city housing situation, but it hadn't availed itself for an interview at the time of editing this program.